Okay. Okay. Today's topic, we're going to cover the roast phases, and we're also going to cover the way the temperature probe in the KAFFELOGIC tracks what's actually going on during those roast phases. So that's kind of two different topics in a way, but let's kick off with talking about the roast phases as a general thing. Just share the KAFFELOGIC default screen that we normally see. I might just switch that to like that. We might not even worry about rate of rise at the moment. So what we're interested in is talking just initially about the phases that the roast goes through and how we divide them up, and what the markers are and what they're called. So the initial phase of the roast is often called the drying phase. Now, I'm actually in favour now. Originally I thought, oh, that's a really terrible name, because although drying is going on, it's a much more important phase than drying implies. Drying sort of implies it's just early stage you just need to get over and get on to the interesting part of the roasting, when in fact it turns out it's actually one of the most interesting parts of the roasting. So it would be nice to call it establishment phase or activation phase or something lovely like that. However, for other people to understand what we're talking about, it's good to try and standardize our terminology. So I've gone back to talking about it as the drying stage. It's the initial stage of the roast, and it is a critical stage because the main reason is that when you put your beans in the roaster, they have the highest moisture content that they are going to have throughout the entire roasting process. And it is that moisture content that primarily dictates the thermal conductivity of the bean. So if you are putting heat into the bean, to get it into the middle of the bean, you're depending on the thermal conductivity of the bean to get it there. So at the very beginning of the roast, you have the absolute best conditions that are ever going to be there during that roast cycle for getting heat into the centre of the bean. And as the roast proceeds, the beans dry out and they drop in conductivity, and it starts to get slower and slower getting heat into the middle of the bean. So obviously what you do early in this stage here in the roast is pretty important to what happens later, because you've really influenced what's going on in the middle of the bean at the beginning. You don't get the same chance to influence it at the end. So very important stage. How do we know when that first stage has come to an end? Well, it's an event called colour change. And as we've discussed in previous virtual cafes with Wayne, it's a completely movable feast. It's really entirely up to the individual where you decide to think that the colour has changed. Because in fact, it's changing from green to yellow to brown as we go through here. And so the particular marker that you pick is going to be individual to you. And it's not really going to be very likely that everybody around the world is ever going to come to an agreement over what really is colour change. So for that reason, it's really useful if you're comparing your own roasts, but it's going to be a bit more of an open-ended thing if you're trying to compare other people's roasts and where they called colour change, what you call colour change. You would have to negotiate a lot more with the other person you were communicating with to get an agreement on what colour change is. So when I type in expected colour change, I put in 160 because that's where I see it at, and Wayne puts in 180 because that's where he sees it at. So we're actually seeing different things. But it doesn't matter for the purpose of the exercise. So if we split the difference and went to 170, then you could see on our default profile with the default level that the roast is now comprised 23% of drying. Now, the next stage is often called the Maillard stage. What happens, really the significant thing about the changing from the drying stage to the Maillard stage is that the really interesting chemical reactions have been triggered by heat and they start to kick off. And perhaps the most interesting of those reactions is the Maillard reaction. And the significant thing about these reactions that are kicking off in here is that they generally produce extra heat. And so the beans start self-heating. And what you typically will see on your roasting curve is somewhere in the range of 180 degrees to 190 degrees. So somewhere in this lead up zone here. The temperature has a tendency to get above the profile line. And the reason for it tending to get above the profile line is the beans start creating their own heat, and the roast control system takes a little bit of time to catch on to the fact that the dynamics are different in the roast, and during that time it'll often creep up above the line. So that's something that you'll notice. So that little creeping up above the line, you could call that colour change if you wanted to, but see, it's way later than I'm marking colour change, because I'm marking it when they no longer look green. They're starting to look a bit yellowy. I'm going, ding, that's colour change. Whereas we could go right up to 180, 185, 190 degrees and say, no, it's not until there where the chemical reactions are really getting underway, and that's what we're really interested in. So this phase then leads us through a period of exothermic reaction. And what's happening during this phase is building up in the bean is gas pressure, which is largely caused by the vaporization of water. So you're getting basically a buildup of steam pressure in a little chamber. And one of the interesting things about this little chamber that is called a coffee bean is it's a leaky chamber. It's not an airtight chamber like a stainless steel ball. It is a leaky chamber. And so again, if you don't get the speed of everything going right, you're not going to get a nice first crack. Because you're only going to get first crack if you can build the pressure up in a leaky chamber. If you build the pressure up properly in a leaky chamber, that chamber will burst and there's your crack. And obviously you've got about 1,000 beans in your KAFFELOGIC at any one time, give or take, roughly. And so one or two of them are going to be oddballs and they're going to burst early, and so you're likely to hear one or two early cracks. So people will often wait until they've heard about 3 beans pop before they decide that that's first crack. So now we come to the point that determining first crack, again, there's going to be disagreement between 2 different people on when first crack actually begins. I would quite like to look at it as a statistical thing and say, well, every bean only cracks at one instant in time, and therefore first crack must have a mean and a standard deviation, and we could specify first crack by mean and standard deviation, and then it wouldn't start and end, it would actually have a midpoint and a width. However, that's thinking like a statistician and not a coffee roaster. A coffee roaster goes, I can hear the cracks, that's first crack. And everything that's written about and communicated about coffee goes on that basis. So I'm not going to try and change the world. But it is just an interesting thing. It is a statistical process. There are 1,000 beans that are all going to go pop. And so when you decide they have started popping, From a statistical point of view, I actually think it's about the 99% or the 3 standard deviations away from the mean when we actually decide it started. So basically, in terms of the normal graph distribution, we're basically taking the 3 standard deviations either side and going, well, that's first crack. Anyway, on our default curve, it's around about 205, 207, we expect first crack to kick off. And first crack is often considered to be the beginning of the 3rd phase, which is called development. And what's now happening in development is this is post the beans cracking. You know, you can understand it's a bit like a pot on the boil. When a pot is boiling, it won't go hotter than boiling. So once the beans have cracked, they've kind of opened the gate to further reactions going on. And you'll find once they've cracked, there's more exothermic energy coming out from chemical reactions. And so when they crack, they're going to suck heat out of the system as an ordinary evaporative cooling process. And then after that, there's going to be a surge back in the heat as the chemical reactions kick back in a rejuvenated way. So these are the main markers and stages that we work with. If we're going into very dark roasting, then we will hit second crack. And second crack is mediated, I believe, by Wayne, you might correct me on this, but I believe now instead of build-up of water vapor causing first crack, it's build-up of actual carbon dioxide pressure causing second crack. And so the ability is there in the KAFFELOGIC to mark second crack when you're roasting, but you can see that the analysis system we've got for analysing the phases just focuses on the 2 markers and the 3 phases. And so we've basically ignored second crack as part of this analysis. If you went into second crack, what that would mean is your development time just gets bigger. So using that analysis of looking at these 3 numbers, drying time, Maillard time, and development time, then roasting into second crack would just become bigger development time. However, if your intention is to roast into second crack, you'll probably use second crack as a marker for deciding when to end the roast. Okay. That is absolutely all I want to say about the phases. Now, obviously, what I've been doing here is I have been marking expected phases, and they're marking in the roast profile editing screen as vertical lines. Now, if we open a log, I'm trying to open a log that was on the memory stick that I've now unplugged. So not happy. Do we mark it in here? Yeah, so here's a log. In this case, and this is pretty normal, it's only first crack that has been marked because it's the most important marker. They appear on the log as little triangles. So there's a difference between actual point where you mark first crack and the point where you expect first crack. The point of expected first crack is something that goes with the profile, which is an indication that just helps the user understand how the profile works. Actual mark is something that goes with the log, which is your actual experience of running that roast. Cool. Now, are there any questions at this stage that we should handle? Before I want to move on, I'm going to talk about the dynamics of heat in the KAFFELOGIC, which is kind of another topic. So I better take questions now if I've got questions on phases.
So when you have put expected colour change and expected first crack, that is just for our reference. It doesn't affect the roast in any way. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. It's just stored as information with the profile, and the roast control algorithm doesn't pay any attention at all. So when the roast controller goes into countdown for first crack, that is only because you have logged first crack, and it doesn't look at the expected first crack at all. Cool. Anyone else?
Chris, I think it's I think just as a little bit of a tip, you can use your expected first crack and your expected color change. If you're putting in color change, you can use it as a reference for your next roast. So for example, I now take my log and I look at my log, and I then note the first crack, for example, or even my color change in my first crack on my previous roast. I then move to the profile that I'm going to roast again, which will be the same profile. And what I could do then is I could then take my expected phases, and I could then take the log in which I had my previous roast, and I could then put those into my expected changes, if that makes sense.
And in fact,
so my color
if you do extract profile from log,
there we go.
it actually gives you you can just copy that straight across, and you can go, oh, well, I expected it at 209, but I actually logged it at 210, so I'm going to take that as my new expected.
There we go. Yeah. Which is cool, because what it does is it just gives you a reference to your next roast. So, you know, when you look at it, you say, well, you know what, the goal of roasting in this way is to get your eye, almost your eye set in on where you're expecting certain things to happen with certain coffees. So for example, I've now bought a coffee, it's a Guatemala, but the guy who sold it to me actually dug in the wrong bag, and he actually sold me a Guatemala, but it was 4 years old, for example. And I'm used to using a Guatemala that's kind of current crop. Now that's going to make a difference. So as we roast that coffee, we're really going to see a difference in our drying phase, if we can call it that, which then means that we'll push our color, our expected color, we'll push that out, and we'll push our first crack out. Does that make sense? So it just gives you a nice reference point to use roast on roast on roast. And what it kind of does is it just gets your eye into certain things that I'm expecting to hear first crack. And now I go, well, first crack's actually happening a minute 50 after where I expect it to happen with this specific coffee. What's wrong? And we can start to ask the questions. Or it's happening a minute before. Usually I'm expecting it to happen. What's wrong with this coffee? So we can use it as a tool from a KAFFELOGIC perspective to actually give us a bit more clarity in our roast back on back. And basically just to keep our origin true. In saying that, though, we have to get that drying phase. Everything in roasting starts from that drying phase. It starts from putting a good foundation down for us to then layer that foundation with flavor and with taste, because that's effectively what happens in that Maillard reaction phase. Is there we're developing flavor, we're developing taste within our coffee. We're not only developing it externally from an external source, i.e. heat into your bean, we're also developing what the bean has to offer, which is its origin taste that we're trying to manipulate and move. So it's crucial that we don't lose sight of that phase. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to kind of move on now, and my next topic is almost just like a completely different topic, but related, if that makes sense. Now, I am just trying to find buttons on my screen. Here we go. I'm going to go to the whiteboard, because what I want to talk about is what's actually going on in our roast. So we see during a roast a temperature curve doing roughly something like this. And we call it the bean temperature, but it's not 100% exactly the bean temperature. So let's think about the temperature of the air that's coming into the chamber. And the actual temperature of the air coming into the chamber is going to be something like that. It's going to be hot. And the temperature of the beans is going to be down here at room temperature. So what's actually happening is that heat is flowing from the air into the beans. And so the air is getting cooler and the beans are getting warmer. And the line that we are measuring, we're actually measuring air temperature. So if there's a bean here, that's the bean temperature, the true bean temperature. Then the air temperature has got, see how the air temperature and the bean temperature are always in this relationship. The air will be hotter than the bean. It'll never be the other way around. We can't drive a positive rate of rise if the air is cooler than the bean. That'll create cooling. So we've always got the air hotter than the bean. And this gap in here is what is actually driving the bean to warm up, to get hotter. Now, of course, it's actually a really big gap when we start in the bottom of the chamber, because in the bottom of the chamber, the temperature of the air coming in is this. But this one here is the temperature of the air as it's passing over the temperature probe. So basically, the air passing over the temperature probe will always be hotter than the bean. So the true bean line, now I'm just trying to work out, I thought I had all this mastered, but I really just want to change colour, don't I? Here we go. The true bean temperature is going to flow along underneath the air temperature like this. It's going to get closer and closer. It's not quite going to be that wiggly either, and it's going to get closer and closer as we go on through the roast. Oh, it's not going to be that wiggly. Now, the reason this is significant is that if you turn the airspeed up in the roaster, then basically that is going to move this black line up. It's not going to, if you want to keep the red line the same. If the red line is the bean temperature and you keep that exactly the same, but you turn the air up, then that has to push the black line further up. And this explains why you can't just jump in on your KAFFELOGIC and change the fan profile without thinking carefully about how it will affect where first crack appears. Because if, let us say that first crack is right here, then that might be a temperature of 200 degrees. And on the probe, we've got 205 degrees. But if we crank the airspeed up, that same probe will now show 210 degrees at first crack. So when we say, oh, we expect first crack at 205 degrees, that's at a particular airspeed. And if we were running a profile with a higher airspeed, then those same beans would have a first crack at a slightly different temperature. So this is fairly complex, advanced stuff, and my drawing's fairly rough and ready, but it's just really to make clear, once you start getting into this fine level of profile design, that you need to realize the beans are always a little bit behind the probe in terms of temperature. They're not always exactly doing what the probe is doing. And that by manipulating airspeed, you can make a difference to the differential between the probe and the bean. And this appears to give shifts in first crack temperature, which are in fact artifacts of the airspeed and not true changes in what the beans are doing. One of the profiles on the community page has got quite a different airspeed profile, and that's the fire starter profile. And so you'll find first crack on the fire starter profile appears to be quite a few degrees hotter than it is on other profiles. And that's the explanation. It's the actual higher airspeed causing that shift. I don't know, has that explanation been useful to anyone? And are there any questions arising from that at this stage?
Does the higher airspeed not transfer more heat to the beans?
Well, there will be that's a factor. Overall, with a higher airspeed, well, it kind of works like this: the air coming into the bottom of the chamber, if you bring that air in as slowly as you can, then it's spending more time in contact with the beans at the bottom and transferring more heat into the beans at the bottom. So by the time it gets to the top, it's not transferring as much heat into the beans because it's already given up a lot of heat getting there. Whereas if you put that air through nice and fast, it gives a little heat all the way up and then is replaced by more air, which gives a little heat all the way up. And so you're actually getting more even and faster heating throughout the whole bean mass with faster air.
Right, so it's a heat distribution thing more than anything.
Well, yeah, it's quite complex. So yeah, there's a heat distribution factor going on there. And so the result with faster air is more heat going into the beans more evenly, and also a bigger differential between the temperature probe and the bean. Whereas with slower air, there's more time for the air to reach equilibrium with the bean, and therefore by the time it gets to the probe, a smaller gap between probe and bean.
It would also be an issue with the amount of beans inside the chamber. Fewer beans might cause that temperature to shift a little earlier because, or perhaps because they've reached their temperature quicker, rather than a very crowded chamber, which would cause a bit more of an erratic response. Is that true to say? So the amount of beans inside there?
That is true to say, and that's one of the factors why with a large production roaster you just cannot emulate what you can do in a small sample roaster like this, because you just can't get the heat distributed through all the beans, whatever method you use of pumping heat into the system, even if you're pumping hot air into the system, the beans are sucking the heat out of the hot air, and basically we put a lot more hot air to beans ratio in than you possibly could manage in a production roaster. You can see it in the Ikawa, which has a half of the batch size of the KAFFELOGIC. Their profiles tend to run a whole lot faster, and that's for that very same reason as well, that if you halve the batch size, you can increase the rate at which you get heat into the beans. And you can run a 70 or 60 gram batch in the KAFFELOGIC, and it will roast perfectly well, but obviously it is essentially following a different profile curve than what full batch is because of all those factors.
Cool.
Yeah.
So basically your profile curve when you design it, the blue line, it is the probe temperature, it's not the bean temperature, so it doesn't, is it?
That is correct. It is the probe temperature, which is a close approximation to bean temperature. But in reality, bean temperature has got to always be underneath the probe temperature. It's a question of by how much. The reason profile roasting works is that it's consistent from roast to roast. So long as has been pointed out, so long as you keep the batch size pretty constant. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. I mean, I measure with a scoop, I get between 100 and 120 grams going in. It's absolutely fine over that sort of range. And it will be a consistent lag behind. But then as soon as you start changing the airspeed, that changes everything. And so the same profile might not just work with a different airspeed profile. They have to be quite carefully married.
Chris, is there, well, I see with most of these profiles, the fan speed strategy seems to be sort of start high, sort of ramp down, then to a lower speed, and then just sort of stick at a lower speed.
I might have to take that question tomorrow because we're about to run out of our 40-minute.
Oh, okay, sure, okay.
Are you okay to save that and hit us with that first thing tomorrow morning?
Yep, yeah, that's fine, thanks. Yep.
Yeah, that'd be really good. Yeah. Neat. Yeah, because I think that's definitely a good thing we want to discuss, because we are getting into why would you change the fan speed and what does it look like, and we'll have a bit of more of a dive into that tomorrow. Answer your question. Okay. Yeah.
Really good.
Cool. Anyone else got a quick comment? Otherwise, thanks very much for coming, everyone, and tomorrow we'll have an open Q&A session.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, see you tomorrow.
Well, cheers.
Thank you.